Personal reflection. There's something about the old timber country that stays with you, the smell of pine sap in summer heat, the sound of an axe biting wood before dawn, back when men earned their bread by the strength of their backs, and a handshake still meant something. The frontier had a way of testing what you were made of, not with gunfights or glory, but with thirst and dust, and the choice between your last swallow of water and a stranger's need. This is a story about one such choice, made by a man whose name nobody remembers now, but whose kindness planted seeds that still grow. Sometimes the smallest acts of mercy carry the heaviest weight. Story. The sun hammered down past noon, and Thomas's shirt clung to his back like wet canvas. 4 hours into the sugar pine, and his shoulders burned with each swing of the axe. The canteen at his hip slapped lighter now, maybe 3 swallows left if he was careful. He drove the blade deeper, feeling the wedge crack run up the trunk like a gunshot. Hoofbeats on the wagon road behind him. Henley pulled up on his bay Morgan, didn't dismount, looked down from the saddle the way a man looks at a stump. "You're behind, Thomas." Thomas set the axe against the trunk. Copper taste bloomed at the back of his throat. "Tree'll be down by 3. "You were behind last week, too." Henley turned the horse without waiting for answer. "Contract's up end of month. Best pick up your pace." Dust kicked up as the Morgan went. Thomas stood there watching it settle. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He picked up the axe again. His hands knew the rhythm even when his mind wandered rent-due. Quota short. The 2-mile walk home, still ahead with that canteen, getting lighter every hour. If you're following this story from your porch or your favorite chair, I'd be glad to know where you've settled in today. Sometimes it helps knowing we're walking these old roads together, even when the miles between us are many. The wedge split deeper with the next 5 swings. Thomas felt the vibration run up the axe handle into his palms. The sugar pine groaned that low sound wood makes when it's about to give. He stepped back, axe still raised, and watched the crown sway once, twice. The crack ran visible up the trunk and the whole tree tilted. Slow at first, then faster. It hit the ground with a sound like thunder rolling through the hills. Dust rose in a cloud. Thomas lowered the axe and stood there breathing hard. His shirt stuck to his ribs where sweat had soaked through. Salt crusted white at his collar. The sun hung overhead like something waiting to fall. He checked the sky maybe 2 hours past noon. The tree was down, but it needed limbing, sectioning, tomorrow's work. His back sent a hot wire of pain up his spine when he bent to pick up his lunch pail, empty except for crumbs. He'd eaten the salt pork and dried apples by 10 that morning. The canteen came off his belt. He unscrewed the cap, tipped it back and felt the slosh inside 3 swallows. Maybe 4 if he was careful. His throat clicked when he tried to swallow nothing. He screwed the cap back on without drinking and hooked it to his belt. 2 miles left to his cabin. The wagon road wound through open country where there wasn't any shade until the cottonwoods near the dry creek bed. His legs felt heavy when he shouldered the axe and started walking. Dust rose with each step. It coated his boots, his canvas trousers, got into his nose and mouth. A dust devil spun itself to life 50 yards ahead, danced across the road, throwing grit, then died. Heat came up off the stones in waves that bent the air. The canteen slapped against his hip with each step. Slap, slap, slap. A rhythm that marked off the distance. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, watching for the bend where the cottonwoods started, almost halfway if he could just keep moving. Then he saw something. Not moving. Just a dark shape, maybe 100 yards off where the road curved. Too big for a coyote, too still for anything living. He squinted against the glare, but the heat shimmer made everything waver. His hand went to the canteen without thinking. The metal burned hot through the canvas cover even in shade. He kept walking. Whatever it wasn't getting up. The shape got bigger with each step. 50 yards now. His vision narrowed at the edges from the heat, and his mouth tasted like old copper, but he could see it clearer. Dark fabric. Something sprawled across the stones. Not a coyote, a person. Thomas came closer. The shape didn't move. He shifted the axe to his other shoulder and kept his eyes fixed on it. 50 yards now. 40. The sun made everything shimmer, and he had to squint to see clear. Not an animal. Too much fabric. Rags, maybe. Someone's cast-off clothes blown into the road. 30 yards. He saw a hand. Fingers curled in the dust. His boots stopped. The hand was attached to an arm. The arm disappeared under faded cloth that might have been a dress once. He stood there with the axe heavy on his shoulder and his canteen slapping his hip, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A person. Lying in the road, not moving except for the hand. The fingers twitched once like they were trying to grab something that wasn't there. Thomas started forward again. His throat was dry as sand. The canteen sloshed when he moved. 3 swallows, maybe 4. He got close enough to see it was a woman. Old. Her bonnet torn half off her head. Gray hair stuck to her face with sweat or dirt, or maybe blood, he couldn't tell which. The dress was calico, faded to almost no color at all. Her shoes were brogans, with the soles worn clean through, and burlap strips wound around them like bandages coming undone. She lay on her side in the dirt. Her lips were cracked white. When he knelt down beside her, the dust came up and stuck to his wet palms, where they gripped the axe handle. "Ma'am." Her eyelids fluttered. She tried to lift her head and couldn't. A sound came out of her throat, not words, just a dry rasp like wind through dead grass. Thomas set the axe down careful. His knees pressed into the hot stones of the road. The woman's chest moved up and down, but shallow. Too shallow. Her skin had gone the color of ash. He'd seen a horse die of thirst once, and the animal had looked like this near the end. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. Just slits. She looked at him, but he couldn't tell if she saw him or just the light. Her lips moved. That rasp again. He leaned closer and caught a smell like dust and something sour underneath. Water. Not a rasp. A word. Barely there, but he heard it. His hand went to his belt. The canteen came off and the weight of it sat in his palm. Warm metal through canvas. He unscrewed the cap and heard the water slosh inside. 3 swallows. The 2 miles left to walk. The sun still overhead. His cabin with the water barrel that he'd need to refill from the creek tomorrow because it was running low. The woman's eyes closed. Her hand in the dust stopped moving. Thomas looked at the canteen in his hand, looked at the woman. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. The copper taste at the back of his throat had gotten stronger. He could feel his heartbeat in his temples. The sun pressed down on his neck and shoulders like a hand pushing him into the ground. His thumb rubbed the canvas cover. 3 swallows, 4 if he stretched it. He tipped the canteen over her mouth and started pouring. Water caught the sunlight as it fell. The woman's mouth opened wider. Her throat worked, trying to swallow. She choked, coughed. Water ran down her chin into the dust, turning it dark. Thomas tipped the canteen again, and she drank. Her hand came up and gripped his wrist. The fingers felt like bird bones, wrapped in paper skin. He kept pouring. The canteen got lighter in his hand. Her eyes opened wider now. Some color came back into her lips just a little, like watching life seep in from somewhere. She drank until she couldn't anymore, and then her grip loosened and her hand fell back into the dust. Thomas looked at the canteen. Still something left sloshing inside. Maybe 2 swallows. He raised it to his own lips. The metal rim touched his cracked skin. His throat ached for it. The copper taste in his mouth had gotten so bad, he could barely swallow. He could feel his heartbeat in his temples and behind his eyes. He lowered the canteen, held it out to the woman again. She drank what was left. When the last drops were gone, he screwed the cap back on. The weight of it in his hand felt wrong, too light, like holding air. He hooked it back on his belt anyway. The woman's eyes stayed open now. She looked at him. Her lips moved and sound came out, but weak. He had to lean close to hear, "You're richer." The words came out barely louder than breath. Her voice had a quality to it despite the rasp. Something underneath the roughness that didn't quite match the burlap-wrapped shoes and torn dress. "Then you think." Thomas didn't know what that meant. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth when he tried to speak. "Can you stand, ma'am?" She tried, got her elbow under her and pushed. Made it maybe 3 inches off the ground before her arm gave out and she collapsed back into the dust. He looked at the road ahead. Still 1.5 miles left, maybe more. The cottonwoods were visible in the distance, but the shade was too far for her to walk, even if she could stand. The sun pressed down on everything, like it meant to drive the world flat. Thomas got to his feet. His knees protested. He bent and worked his arms under the woman and lifted. She weighed almost nothing. Just bones and fabric and the smell of dust. He got her positioned on his back the way he'd carry a sack of grain, her arms over his shoulders, her weight against his spine. She didn't have the strength to hold on, so he hooked his elbows under her knees and stood up straight. The axe. He couldn't carry both. He looked at it, lying in the road, his Springfield double bit with the hickory handle he'd carved himself. Someone would steal it, probably. That didn't matter now. He started walking. Each step sent jarring pain up through his boots into his shins and knees. The woman's breath came shallow against his neck. She smelled like dust and sweat and something else he couldn't name. Death, maybe, or close enough to it. The cottonwoods were 1/4 mile off. He counted his steps to keep his mind from thinking about his throat. 1, 2, 3. The empty canteen slapped his hip. 4, 5, 6. The woman's weight shifted, and he had to adjust his grip. Her head lolled against his shoulder. His vision started to narrow at the edges, a dark ring closing in. He blinked hard, and it retreated but didn't go away completely. 50 yards to the cottonwoods. His legs were shaking. 40 yards. He stumbled on a stone and nearly went down. Caught himself. Kept moving. 30 yards. The ring in his vision got darker. 20 yards. He could taste blood now at the back of his throat mixing with the copper. His hands trembled where they gripped the woman's legs. 10 yards. 5. The shade when he reached it felt like falling into cold water. He knelt down slow and let the woman slide off his back onto the ground. She lay there breathing, still alive. Her eyes were closed, but her chest rose and fell steady now. The dry creek bed ran along the tree line. He looked at it. Just dusty stones and willow roots. But the willows were still green, which meant water somewhere underneath. He got down on his hands and knees and dug with his fingers in the creek bottom until he felt dampness, kept digging. Water seeped up slow. Not much, but some. He unhooked his canteen from his belt, set it down next to the woman. She could fill it from the seep if she had the strength. If she didn't, well. He'd done what he could. Thomas stood up. The walk home stretched ahead. 1.5 miles without water. Maybe more. The sun still high and hot. His shirt stuck to his back and his legs felt hollow, like the bones had turned to paper. He started walking, put one boot in front of the other, kept his eyes on the road. The copper taste filled his mouth, and the taste of blood sounded stronger. After half a mile, the dark ring came back to his vision, and didn't leave. He focused on his cabin door. Just get to the door, the water barrel inside, 1 foot. Then the other. Just get to the door. Spots appeared in his vision, white flashes that came and went. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He counted steps, but lost track around 300. Started over. Lost track again. The cabin appeared finally through the shimmer. He could barely work the latch. His hands trembled so bad it took 3 tries. He got the door open and went straight to the water barrel and dipped the tin cup. Drank without stopping. The water was warm and tasted like wood, but he drank 4 cups, one after another, until his stomach cramped. Then he sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and closed his eyes. His throat still ached. His head pounded, but the shaking in his hands started to ease after a while. The spots in his vision faded. He sat there breathing until the light through the window changed from white to gold. 3 days. He had 3 days before he needed to be back at the timber claim. 3 days to rest, to drink, to try and forget the feeling of that empty canteen on his belt and the 1.5 mile walk home with blood in his mouth. He didn't go back to check on the woman, didn't know if she lived or died. Just knew he'd given her what he had and he needed to survive himself. On the 4th day, he went back to work. The sugar pine still lay where it had fallen. His axe was gone from where he'd left it on the road. He'd known it would be. That same afternoon, the deputy came. The hoofbeats came from the south road 3 days after Thomas went back to work. He looked up from sectioning the fallen sugar pine and saw a rider on a dun gelding coming at an easy trot. Not Henley, this horse was government issue, the kind that came with a badge. The man wore a leather vest with something pinned to it that caught the afternoon light. Thomas set down his saw and straightened. His back popped. The rider pulled up 10 feet away and didn't dismount. Dust settled around the horse's legs in the still air. "You Thomas Brennan." "That's right." The deputy reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded paper, leaned down from the saddle and held it out. Thomas wiped sawdust off his hands and took it. The paper was heavy stock official weight. The deputy pulled out a stub of pencil and a small ledger from his vest pocket. "Need you to sign for it. Right there at the bottom. Your mark or your name. Either's fine." Thomas signed his name in the ledger. His hand left a smudge of pine sap on the page. The deputy tucked the ledger away and gathered his reins. "What is it?" "Legal summons. You got to appear in Reading a week from today." "That's day 14. The deputy touched his hat brim. "Court convenes at 9:30. Don't be late." The dun kicked into a trot, and Thomas stood there holding the paper. It was still folded. He could see a red wax seal on the outside, the official county seal pressed into it. His name written in careful copperplate script across the front. Thomas Brennan. The letters looked important somehow, foreign. He waited until the deputy was out of sight before he opened it. The words didn't make sense at first. He had to read them twice, then 3 times. Legal language things like defendant and contested survey boundaries and unlawful timber harvest. His name kept appearing over and over. Thomas Brennan, Thomas Brennan, Thomas Brennan. Like they were talking about someone else who happened to have the same name. The charge was cutting trees outside his claim lines, harvesting timber on disputed land without proper permission or authorization. The hearing was set for day 14 in Reading at the county courthouse. If he didn't appear, judgment would go against him automatically. Fines, maybe jail time. Loss of his timber contract for certain. Thomas folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. His hands were steady, but something in his chest felt too tight, like he'd laced his boots wrong, but higher up. He picked up the saw and went back to work. Drew the blade through the pine section, back and forth. The teeth bit wood and sawdust fell in small piles at his feet. He kept working until the sun started to drop low and red through the trees, and then he gathered his tools and walked the 2 miles home. That night he sat at his plank table with the coal oil lamp burning. The summons lay flat in front of him. He'd read it 5 more times now, and the words hadn't changed any. He pulled out his claim map from the oilcloth tube, where he kept it rolled up safe, and spread it next to the summons. The boundaries were clear as day. The surveyor had marked them back in 79 iron stakes driven 3 feet deep at each corner so they wouldn't shift or get moved. Thomas had walked those boundary lines himself. Before he ever cut a single tree, everything he'd harvested was inside those boundaries, everything legal and proper. But Henley had money for lawyers. Thomas had $12 silver in a Bull Durham tobacco tin hidden under the floorboard beneath his bed. He held the summons up to the lamplight. The county seal showed through the paper red wax with the official stamp pressed in. The word defendant in tall letters that seemed to get bigger the longer he looked. His thumb smudged the ink at the corner where he was gripping it too hard. Behind him, his shadow bent huge and wrong on the cabin wall. The lamp flame wavered when wind came through the gaps in the boards. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere up in the timber country. Another one answered from further off. Thomas sat there staring at the paper until the lamp started to gutter low, and then he didn't bank the stove properly before he went to bed. Sleep didn't come easy. He lay on his rope bed listening to the corn husk tick-crackle every time he shifted. The darkness pressed down. He kept seeing those words: defendant, unlawful, contested boundaries. His boundaries weren't contested. They were marked clear with iron stakes sunk deep. This wasn't about boundaries. The next morning he rode Pete's borrowed mule to Pete's claim 3 miles north. Pete was working a stand of ponderosa on a slope when Thomas came up leading the mule. Pete set down his axe and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. Thought you were laid up sick. Was. 3 days. Thomas pulled the summons from his pocket. Need to ask you something. Pete took the paper and read it slow. His face didn't change much, but his jaw got tight around the edges. He handed it back without saying anything at first. Henley. Has to be. What do you need? Witness. Someone who can testify I never cut outside my boundaries. Pete looked at the ground, scraped his boot in the dirt. A long moment passed. I never saw your claim lines. Thomas. Worked up here the whole time. Different section. You know I wouldn't cut illegal timber. Knowing ain't the same as testifying in court. Pete met his eyes finally. I got 3 kids at home. A wife. Henley's my boss, same as yours. I testify against him in court. I lose my contract same day. Maybe get blacklisted from every timber operation in the county. Thomas folded the summons and put it back in his pocket. His throat felt tight. Yeah. I'm sorry, Thomas. I truly am. Thomas nodded once. He turned to go and Pete called after him. Try Caleb. He's the one surveyed your claim back in 79. He's got the records in his books, official survey records. Where's he at these days? Old homestead past Dry Creek. You know the place. Thomas knew it. He mounted the mule and rode west. It took near 2 hours to reach Caleb's place. The cabin roof sagged bad in the middle like it might cave in come winter. Chickens scratched in the bare dirt yard. An old hound lifted its head from the porch step, and looked at Thomas, but didn't bother to bark. Thomas called out from the yard, "Caleb, you home?" The door opened slow. An old man came out 70 years at least, maybe more, bent at the shoulders like he'd carried too much weight for too long. Gray beard came down to the middle of his chest. He squinted at Thomas against the afternoon light. "I know you, Thomas Brennan. You surveyed my timber claim back in '79. North Vacation, quarter-mile from the ridge line. Did I?" Caleb came down off the porch, one step at a time. His hands shook even when he wasn't holding anything. "Can't remember all of them. Done a lot of surveys over the years." Thomas pulled out both the summons and his claim map, handed them over. "This one. You marked it with iron stakes. 4 corners." Caleb took the map and held it close to his face. His eyes weren't good anymore. He studied it for a long time without speaking. Then he nodded slow. "I remember now. Good stand of sugar pine on that parcel. Set those stakes myself, 3 feet deep, so they wouldn't move even in a hard frost. Can you testify to that? In court?" Something changed in the old man's face. Something shut down behind his eyes like a door closing. He handed the map back. "My records are gone. Gone. Fire last spring. Burned up my whole shed out back. All my survey books were stored in there." Caleb looked away toward the hills in the distance. Real convenient timing. That fire. Month after Henley started sniffing around people's claims, trying to expand his operations. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You saying Henley burned your records? I ain't saying nothing for certain. Just telling you the books are gone. Can't testify to what I don't have documented." Caleb turned back toward his cabin, climbed the steps, slow. "I'm sorry, son. I marked your claim fair and true, back in '79. But without my survey books, all I got is an old man's memory. That won't hold up against Henley's lawyers in a county courthouse." The door closed. Thomas stood there in the yard with the hound watching him and the chickens scratching and the summons in his pocket feeling heavier than it should. The mule shifted its weight and blew air through its nostrils. He rode back to his cabin as the sun dropped low and turned everything red. Nobody else to ask. Pete couldn't help without risking his family. Caleb wouldn't help without records that had burned up convenient-like. The other loggers all worked for Henley, too. They'd be too scared to testify even if they wanted to. That night, Thomas sat on his porch step as the sky went from red to purple to black. Stars came out one by one until the whole Milky Way stretched overhead like someone had spilled salt. No moon yet, just stars, and the sound of wind moving through the pine trees and the creek running over stones down in the draw. His axe leaned against the doorframe beside him, where he'd propped it. He reached down and picked up a handful of dirt from the ground in front of the step, opened his hand and let it sift through his fingers slow. Dust and small stones and pine needles. It fell back to earth grain by grain. "This is mine," he said to the darkness. The wind didn't answer. The stars didn't care. He'd go to the hearing alone in 6 days, stand up in front of the judge with no lawyer and no witnesses, and no proof except his word, and a map that Burnside would probably say was forged. Try to explain that he'd done nothing wrong, try to make them believe that an honest man's word still meant something. He already knew how it would end. Inside the cabin, the lamp still burned. He could see the yellow glow through the window. The summons sat on his table where he'd left it. Thomas stayed outside in the dark and thought about the old woman on the road. Her cracked lips, the rasp of her voice. "You're richer than you think." He laughed once, short and bitter. The sound didn't carry far. Day 17. 3 days before the hearing. Thomas lay on his rope bed and listened to the creek run over stones somewhere down in the dark. The corn husk tick crackled when he shifted his weight. 3 in the morning, maybe. Too early to rise, too late for sleep to come back. His eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling boards he couldn't see. The hearing was 3 days off. Day 20. He kept counting it different ways, but the number never changed. 72 hours, 4,320 minutes. However he counted it, the sum stayed the same. He sat up. His feet found the cold plank floor. He went to the stove and stirred the banked coals with the poker and added kindling piece by piece. Blew on the embers until flame caught orange and small. Put the coffee pot on to boil. Sat at the table in his union suit and waited for the water to heat. His father's face came back to him without asking. Not the way the old man looked at the end, broken and silent, after the bank took the Ohio farm. Earlier than that, when Thomas was maybe 10 and they'd had a good wheat harvest, and his father had stood in the barn doorway at sunset, with his thumbs hooked in his braces, looking out over the fields like a man who owned something worth owning. The bank auction happened 3 years later. His father sat on the porch while strangers walked through their house pricing furniture and kitchen goods and his mother's sewing machine. Wouldn't go inside, just sat there on that porch. Didn't speak for 2 days after. When he finally did speak again, his voice came out different, smaller somehow. Like something had broken inside that changed how sound traveled through him. Thomas poured coffee into his tin cup. The metal burned his palm through the handle. He drank it anyway, bitter and black and hot enough to scald. He'd left Ohio at 19, worked his way west doing whatever paid railroad crew out of Pittsburgh, farmhand in Kansas, stable mucker in Denver. Took him 3 years to save enough for the timber claim. When he'd first walked this land and seen the sugar pines standing tall in the morning light, with mist still caught in the low places he'd known. This was it. His stake. His proof that a man could start with nothing and build something solid that belonged to him. Now Henley was taking it with lawyers and forged papers and lies told in a courthouse, where Thomas wouldn't know the right words to use even if he had a right to use them. The coffee tasted like ash in his mouth. He drank it all anyway. Dawn came slow through the single window. Gray light first, then pink, then gold. Thomas dressed and walked to his claim. He didn't bring his lunch pail, wasn't planning to be there all day, just needed to do this one thing. The sugar pines stood in rows where the morning sun cut through the branches in shafts you could almost touch. Straight trunks, good timber. He walked among them, touching the bark with his palm until he found the one he wanted. The straightest, 6 feet across at the base, maybe 180 feet tall if you measured true. The kind of tree that would mill clean and sell for $30 if you could get it to the yard without damage. He set his axe down at the base and studied the tree. The way the branches started about 60 feet up where the trunk stayed clear and perfect. The way the morning light came through the needles, making everything green and gold at once. The sound the wind made, passing through like breathing, but bigger. He wanted to remember it all. Then he picked up the axe and started cutting. The first notch went in clean on the 3rd swing. He worked the blade in a rhythm older than conscious thought. His shoulders remembered this even when his mind wandered. Chip, chip, chip. The steel bit wood and sawdust fell in small bright piles at his feet that caught the light. He made the face cut precise 45 degrees. Cutting to the heart of the trunk where the tree would hinge and fall. Sweat started at his hairline, ran down his temple past his ear. He didn't wipe it away, just kept swinging. The axe head rang against the wood. The sound carried through the timber stand clear and sharp. No one else around to hear it, just him and the tree and the work. He moved to the back cut when the face was finished. Set it higher than the face cut by 2 inches like you're supposed to. Drove a steel wedge into the cut to keep the blade from binding when the tree started to go. The wood talked back to him, that creaking sound it makes when it knows what's coming. He stepped back and set the axe down and watched. The crown swayed once, slow, then faster. The crack ran visible up the trunk like lightning climbing. The whole tree leaned away from him, gradual at first, and then it was falling through its own shadow and it hit the ground with a sound like the earth splitting open from underneath. Dust and pine needles rose in a cloud. The ground shook under Thomas's boots. He stood there breathing hard. His shirt stuck to his ribs where sweat had soaked through. The tree lay exactly where he'd aimed it, not a branch broken on the fall. Perfect. He spent the rest of that day and into evening limbing it. Took his time, made every stroke count and clean. The branches came off smooth, and he stacked them to the side in neat piles. When the sun started to drop, he went home and slept 4 hours and came back at first light. The second day he sectioned the trunk, 6 sections for the mill. Each cut placed careful where the grain ran straightest. He worked until his hands had new blisters forming on top of old calluses, and his back ached deep in the muscles along his spine. The trunk lay in perfect sections when he finally stepped back and looked at what he'd done. The tree that had stood here since before he was born now lay ready for hauling. This was his testament. Even if they took the claim tomorrow, this tree would prove something. Prove he'd been here. Prove he knew his trade. Prove he'd treated the timber with respect and skill and care. He shouldered his axe and walked home as the sun dropped red through the trees. That evening, day 19, night before the hearing, he sat at his table with paper and pencil stub. Started writing to Pete. Asked him to file claim on this parcel if Thomas went to jail. Asked him to keep the work going. Wrote 3 lines in his rough hand and stopped. Pete had 3 kids, a wife. Couldn't risk taking on another man's fight when his own family needed feeding. Thomas struck a match and held the corner of the paper to the flame. Watched the fire eat the words he'd written. Set it in his tin plate and let it burn down to black ash that crumbled when he touched it. The lamp flickered in a draft. Outside, the coyotes were calling to each other, working their way up the draw. They'd probably found something dead and were gathering. He got down on his knees beside the bed. Hadn't prayed proper since his mother died when he was 12. Didn't know if he remembered how. Wasn't even sure who he was talking to anymore. But he folded his hands anyway because that's what you did, and closed his eyes and spoke into the dark cabin. I don't know what to say here. I did honest work, followed the law best I knew how. Don't seem like that matters much against men with money and lawyers. So I guess I'm just asking. Let me stand up straight tomorrow. Don't let them make me crawl. That's all I'm asking. Just let me stand up straight when they tell me I'm losing everything. His voice sounded small in the empty room. No one answered back. He didn't expect them to. Wasn't that kind of prayer, probably. He got into bed and pulled the thin blanket up, closed his eyes. His body ached from 2 days of hard work. Good ache, earned. He thought about the sugar pine lying in perfect sections, and sleep came easier than it had in days. When he woke, it was still dark, but getting light at the edges. Day 20. The hearing. Thomas dressed in his good clothes, the wool trousers without patches, the cotton shirt he'd washed special and hung to dry, the string tie. He looked at himself in the small mirror over the basin. A timber man's face looking back. Scarred hands, beard that needed trimming. He didn't bother with the trimming. He walked to Pete's place in the gray light before sunrise. Pete had the mule saddled already waiting. Didn't say much. Just handed Thomas the reins and gripped his shoulder once hard. "Good luck to you." Thomas nodded. Couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat. He mounted up. The mule knew the road to Reading. 12 miles. He'd be there by mid-morning if he kept steady. The sun came up behind him as he rode, cast his shadow long on the road ahead. He watched it move, a dark shape on a mule, growing shorter as the sun climbed higher. The mule's hooves made steady rhythm on the packed dirt. Clop, clop, clop. His mind went quiet after the first few miles. He'd said everything he had to say in that prayer last night. Now there was just the road, and the courthouse waiting at the end of it, and whatever came after. The miles passed under the mule's feet. He saw other travelers' freight wagon heading south, loaded with timber probably. A family in a buckboard going north with their belongings tied down. Nobody spoke, just lifted a hand in passing and kept going about their business. Reading appeared finally around a long curve in the road. Brick buildings, the railroad depot with smoke rising, people moving on the streets doing the work of living. Thomas rode straight through town to the courthouse, big brick building 2 stories tall, stone steps leading up to double doors. He tied the mule to the hitching rail out front and stood there looking at those steps for a long moment. His legs didn't want to climb them. He made them move anyway. Inside smelled like wood polish and tobacco smoke and old paper. A deputy sat at a desk near the door, looked up when Thomas entered. "Help you. Got a hearing. Name's Thomas Brennan." The deputy checked a ledger on his desk, ran his finger down the page. "Courtroom B, upstairs, second door on your left." Thomas climbed the stairs. His boots sounded too loud on the wood. The courthouse was filling up men in good suits, women in proper dresses with their hair done up. The kinds of people who belonged in places like this and knew how to act. He found courtroom B. The door stood open. He looked inside and his stomach dropped hard. The gallery was already full, 20 people maybe. More. He recognized most of them Henley's crew. Loggers who worked his timber operations. The foreman who'd lied about warning Thomas, all of them sitting there waiting to testify against him. Henley sat in the front row, looking straight ahead. Didn't turn when Thomas entered. His lawyer Burnside sat at the prosecution table, organizing stacks of papers into neat piles. Thomas took a seat at the defendant's table, smaller than Burnside's table. Lower somehow, even though they were the same height. Just a wooden chair and a scarred pine table. The chair next to his stayed empty. No lawyer sitting there. No one at all. People filed in behind him, filling the gallery. Thomas sat with his hands flat on the table and didn't look around. A clock on the wall ticked loud in the quiet. 9:15. The hearing was set for 9:30. At 9:20 a side door opened and the judge entered in black robes. Everyone stood. The judge was old gray beard to his chest, gold spectacles, deep lines around his eyes. He settled behind the bench and gestured for everyone to sit. Court is in session. Case of Henley versus Brennan regarding disputed timber boundaries. He looked straight at Thomas. "Mr. Brennan, do you have legal representation?" Thomas stood up. His chair scraped loud. "No, sir." "Can you afford counsel?" "No, sir." The judge wrote something in the ledger in front of him. "You may proceed then as you are." He nodded to Burnside. "Counselor, you may begin." Burnside stood smooth in his three-pieced suit. "Your Honor, the case before you is straightforward. Mr. Brennan has willfully and repeatedly harvested timber outside his legal claim boundaries. We have survey evidence, sworn witness testimony, and documentation of substantial damage to my client's property interests. He started laying out papers on his table, maps, reports, affidavits with official seals and signatures. The stack grew higher. Thomas watched it pile up, all the documentation he didn't have, all the proof he couldn't counter with just his word. The first witness was called. Henley's foreman took the stand and put his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then he lied, said he'd warned Thomas 3 times about cutting outside boundaries, said Thomas had been hostile and threatening when confronted, said Thomas had refused to stop even after multiple warnings. All lies, every word. Thomas opened his mouth to say so, but didn't know what words to use or when you were supposed to speak up. He sat there while the foreman lied under oath, and the judge wrote it all down in his ledger like it was true. The second witness was a surveyor Thomas had never seen before. Young man with clean hands who'd probably never driven a stake in his life. He had charts and maps and testified the boundary markers in that area were unclear and disputed. Said there was legitimate question about where Thomas's claim ended and Henley's lease began. More lies. Thomas's hands gripped the table edge. His knuckles went white. He could feel his pulse in his temples. Burnside entered the survey report as evidence. The judge examined it, asked Thomas if he had counter-evidence to present. Thomas stood up. His chair scraped again. He pulled his claim map from his pocket and unrolled it on the table. "This here's my original survey from 1879, Your Honor. Boundaries are marked clear. Iron stakes at all 4 corners." Burnside was on his feet before Thomas finished speaking. "Objection. Your Honor, we have no way to verify the authenticity of that document. It could have been altered or forged at any time. Your Honor, I never—" The judge held up his hand. "Mr. Brennan, without proper documentation or expert testimony to verify this map's authenticity, I cannot accept it over the official county survey report that's been entered into evidence." Thomas sat down. The map lay on the table in front of him, the boundaries clear as daylight. Might as well have been blank paper for all the good it did. The judge looked at him over his spectacles. "Mr. Brennan, do you have any witnesses who can testify on your behalf?" Thomas's throat felt too tight. "No, sir. Any additional evidence beyond this map? Just my word, sir." The gallery was dead quiet. Thomas could feel all those eyes on him. Henley's men who'd come to watch, the foreman who'd lied, the surveyor who'd lied, all of them watching him sit there with nothing but his word against their documented lies. "Your Honor," Burnside said. His voice carried easy through the quiet courtroom. "The evidence speaks clearly. Mr. Brennan has engaged in systematic illegal timber harvest. We ask for full restitution, immediate surrender of his claim, and appropriate penalties for willful violation of property law." The judge picked up his gavel. Then the courtroom doors opened. Everyone turned. Thomas turned. An old woman stood in the doorway, small, gray hair done up neat under a clean bonnet. She wore a navy traveling dress, good wool. Modest but quality. A man in an expensive suit held her arm steady. They started down the aisle together, slow. Thomas stared. Something about her face, the shape of it, the way she held herself even though she walked careful. It took him a full 3 seconds to place it. The cracked lips, the gray skin, the woman dying in the road. But she was walking now, standing, alive and dressed like she belonged in this courthouse more than anyone else in the room. She came down the aisle and every eye followed her. She looked around the courtroom with sharp gray eyes, and then she looked straight at Thomas. Their eyes met, and his lungs forgot how to pull air. She stopped at the rail separating the gallery from the court. The man with her lawyer, by the look of his suit and the leather case he carried, stepped forward. The judge frowned. "Madam, this hearing is currently in progress. If you have business with the court—" "I have business here, Your Honor." Her voice wasn't weak anymore, wasn't a rasp, clear and strong and sure. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I'm the actual owner of the land these men are arguing about." The courtroom stayed quiet. Every head turned toward the old woman and the man in the expensive suit. Thomas couldn't get enough air into his lungs. His chest pulled in and out, but it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Judge Pemberton took off his gold spectacles, cleaned them on his robe, slow and deliberate, put them back on, looked at the woman standing at the rail. "Mrs. Whitmore, can't say I'm familiar with that name in relation to this property dispute." "No reason you should be, Your Honor." The man with her stepped forward, wing collar starched white, pince-nez glasses catching the light. "I'm Richard Ashford. I practice law in San Francisco. I represent the Whitmore Trust, which holds clear title to 2,400 acres in this county, including all the disputed timberlands at issue in this proceeding." Burnside was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The hearing is nearly concluded and—" "Sit down, Counselor." The judge's voice went hard as iron. He looked at Ashford. "You have documentation to support this claim." Ashford opened his leather briefcase, pulled out papers, thick stack of them bound with ribbon. "Trust deed, property survey conducted by the county in 1877. Tax records going back 12 years, all properly filed and recorded with the county clerk." He approached the bench and handed them up. The judge started reading. His face didn't change expression, but he took his time with each page, turned them slow. 5 minutes passed. Nobody in the courtroom spoke. Someone coughed once. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. The judge looked up finally. "Set the papers down, careful. These appear to be in proper order." He looked past Ashford to where Henley sat. "Mr. Henley, you've brought charges claiming Mr. Brennan damaged your property. But according to these documents, the property in question isn't yours." Henley stood up. His face had gone the color of old tallow. "I have a lease agreement with the trust, Your Honor. That lease grants me exclusive timber rights. Do you have this lease agreement with you today?" Henley looked at Burnside. Burnside shuffled through his papers. "Your Honor, we didn't think it necessary to—" "You filed criminal charges claiming a man damaged property you claim to own. But you don't own it. You lease it." The judge's voice could have stripped bark off trees. "And you didn't bring the lease agreement that would prove you even have legal standing to file these charges." Burnside's face flushed red. "Your Honor, the lease clearly establishes my client's rights. I'd like to see those rights in writing. Counselor, since you don't have that document available, I'm inclined to hear from Mrs. Whitmore." He gestured to the witness stand. "Ma'am, if you'd like to testify, please approach." Mrs. Whitmore walked to the stand, slow but steady. Ashford stayed beside her until she reached the rail, then stepped back. She put her small hand on the Bible when the clerk held it out. Her fingers looked like bird bones against the black leather. The clerk swore her in and she settled into the witness chair, folded her hands in her lap. The judge leaned forward on his elbows. "Mrs. Whitmore, please tell the court your interest in this matter. I own the land they're arguing about. Your Honor, own it through my late husband's investment trust. He passed back in 1880, left me the trust and considerable timber holdings across 3 counties in Northern California. Been running them myself since." Her voice carried through the courtroom, strong, nothing like the rasp Thomas remembered from the road. He sat there gripping the table edge and couldn't look away from her. Go on, the judge said. I make it my business to visit my properties regular. Don't announce myself. Travel plain. Most folks don't know who I am when they see me on the road. She paused, looked around the courtroom. Lets me see how people conduct themselves when they think nobody important is watching. And you were doing this when 2 weeks back, day 10 by my counting. I was walking the South Timber Road that runs through my land. The heat was considerable that day. I'd been walking since dawn, and my water ran out around noon. She stopped. Her hands tightened in her lap. Thomas saw her knuckles go white. I collapsed on that road. Couldn't stand up. Couldn't hardly speak. I thought I was going to die there in the dust. The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. Several people passed me by. 2 men on horseback. I found out later they work for Mr. Henley, a wagon with a family. They all saw me lying there, kept going without stopping. She looked at Thomas. Her gray eyes were clear and sharp, and he couldn't breathe right. Then this man came along. She pointed at him. Mr. Brennan. He stopped, asked if I needed help. I couldn't answer proper, but he didn't need an answer. He gave me water. From his canteen, the judge asked, every drop in it. Poured it out for me until the canteen was empty. Then he carried me a 1/4 mile through that heat to where there was shade and a seep, where I could get more water when I had strength back. Her voice caught once. She cleared her throat. I was dying on that road. Your Honor, this man gave me everything he had when he had nothing to spare. Others passed me by. He stopped. Thomas's throat had gone so tight he couldn't swallow. He remembered the weight of that canteen in his hand, the 2 miles still ahead, the copper taste in his mouth. The judge wrote something in his ledger. What happened after that? I got my strength back, made my way to Reading, contacted my lawyer here. She gestured at Ashford. I'd been hearing reports about Mr. Henley's operations for some time, so I had Mr. Ashford look into it proper. Found out Henley's been filing false boundary claims against multiple timber cutters over the past year, trying to squeeze them off the land so he can expand his operations without paying fair lease rates. Henley shot to his feet. That's a damned... He caught himself. That's a lie, Your Honor. Sit down, Mr. Henley. The judge didn't raise his voice, but Henley sounded like his legs had been cut out from under him. Ashford stepped forward. Your Honor, I have sworn affidavits from 3 other timbermen Mr. Henley has filed similar claims against in the past year. Same pattern each time. False surveys, boundary violations that don't exist, offers to buy them out for pennies on the dollar. He handed up more papers. The judge read through them. His jaw got tighter with each page. When he finished, he looked at Henley, and the look could have frozen water in July. Your Honor, Burnside said. His voice had lost all its smoothness. We had no knowledge that Mrs. Whitmore, your client, has been operating under a lease from the Whitmore Trust for 6 years. Counselor, that lease agreement which you failed to bring today clearly establishes his boundaries. He's been filing false claims on land he doesn't own and never had rights to. The judge set the papers down hard enough that people in the gallery jumped. Mrs. Whitmore, do you wish to press fraud charges against Mr. Henley? No, sir. I just want him off my land. His lease is terminated effective immediately. She looked straight at Henley when she said it. Henley was sweating now. Thomas could see it on his forehead where the light caught it. Dark patches spreading under his arms, through his good suit. All that smoothness gone like water poured out on hot stones. He looked like what he was, a man caught cheating at cards. Mr. Burnside, the judge said, do you have anything else to add? Burnside gathered his papers with shaking hands. No, Your Honor, in light of Mrs. Whitmore's testimony and documentation, we withdraw all charges. All charges against Mr. Brennan are dismissed. The judge picked up his gavel. Mr. Henley, you're fortunate Mrs. Whitmore isn't pressing criminal charges, but if I see you in my courtroom again on similar business, I'll refer the matter to the district attorney myself. Am I clear? Yes, sir. Henley's voice came out hoarse, like he'd been the one walking without water. The gavel came down 3 times. Bang, bang, bang. This hearing is concluded. Court is adjourned. People started standing, talking. The noise rose like a wave. Thomas sat there. His hands still gripped the table. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. Mrs. Whitmore stepped down from the witness stand. Ashford took her arm gentle. They came toward Thomas's table. The crowd parted, gave them room. Nobody wanted to get in their way. She stopped in front of where Thomas sat. He pushed his chair back and stood up. His legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. Mr. Brennan. Her voice was quiet now, just for him. Would you walk with me a moment? He nodded, couldn't get words out past the tightness in his throat. He followed her out through the courtroom. People stared, but nobody said anything. Out into the hall, down the stairs. His boots sounded too loud on the wood. They went outside into the afternoon sun. Thomas blinked hard. His eyes had adjusted to the dim courtroom, and now everything was too bright and sharp. Mrs. Whitmore walked to a bench under an oak tree near the street. Sat down careful. Gestured for Thomas to sit beside her. He sat. Ashford stood a few feet away, close enough if she needed him, but far enough to give them space to talk. You're wondering why I did that, she said. Thomas found his voice finally. Yes, ma'am. I told you on that road. You're richer than you think. She looked at him steady. I've been investing in timber for 20 years. Mr. Brennan made considerable money at it. You know what I learned in all that time. The timber doesn't matter. The money doesn't matter. What matters is finding people who'll do right even when it costs them everything they have. She opened her handbag, pulled out an envelope, handed it to him. That's an offer of employment. Forest manager for my Shasta County holdings. $60 monthly. Company cabin with 2 rooms. Your job would be managing sustainable harvest and reforestation programs. I need someone who treats the land like it's going to outlive him, like it matters beyond next month's profit. Thomas took the envelope. It felt heavy in his hands, heavier than paper should feel. Why me, ma'am? Because you were kind when it cost you everything. She stood up slow. Ashford moved to help, but she waved him off. Read it over careful. You've got a week to decide. My information is inside if you want to reach me. She started toward a carriage waiting on the street. Black paint. Good horses. Ashford followed. Thomas sat there on the bench holding the envelope. His hands were shaking now, all the tension from the hearing coming out at once like water through a broken dam. He opened the envelope, read the first few lines. $60 monthly. More than 5 times what Henley had paid. Company Shibin. Authority to hire a crew. Partnership with the State Agricultural College on forestry methods. His vision blurred. He blinked hard. Read it again to make sure the words were real and not something he'd imagined because he wanted them so bad. A shadow fell across the paper. Thomas looked up. Henley stood there. His face was red now instead of pale, veins standing out on his neck and forehead. You think this changes anything? You think you're something now because some old woman felt sorry for you? Thomas folded the letter, careful, put it in his pocket, stood up. I think I got work to do. You'll fail. You don't know the first thing about managing timber operations. I know enough not to cheat people out of what's theirs. Thomas picked up his hat from the bench. You're finished here. Henley, best move along. Henley's hand went to his belt. For a second, Thomas thought he might pull a gun, but there was nothing there. Just empty leather. Henley's hand dropped. His face went from red to purple. This ain't over, he said. Thomas walked past him toward where Pete's mule was tied. His legs still felt strange, but they carried him. Behind him, he could hear Henley standing there breathing hard. But Thomas didn't look back. He untied the mule and mounted up. The envelope pressed against his ribs where he had tucked it inside his shirt. He turned the mule toward home and started riding. 3 days after the hearing, Thomas rode back to Reading. Found Mrs. Whitmore's office above the land registry building on 2nd Street. The stairs were narrow and steep. He climbed them with his hat in his hand. Ashford met him at the door. Mr. Brennan, come in. The office smelled like beeswax and old paper and leather. Mrs. Whitmore sat at a desk by the window where light came through. She gestured to a chair across from her. Thomas took off his hat and sat. You've decided, she asked. He pulled the signed contract from his pocket. The paper was creased where he'd folded it. He set it on the desk between them, careful. Yes, ma'am. She picked it up, read his signature at the bottom, nodded once. You'll start in 2 weeks. That gives you time to settle your affairs with your current claim. The company cabin is 3 miles north of you where you're living now. 2 rooms, good stove, well out back. You won't share it with anyone. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. The work's harder than cutting timber for wages. You'll be managing 8 men, coordinating with the college on planting schedules, dealing with weather and disease and 100 things that'll go wrong. She folded the contract, put it in a drawer. You'll earn that $60. Thomas stood. I'll do right by it. I know you will. That's why I hired you. He left with a list of names, men Mrs. Whitmore had already vetted for his crew. Pete was first on the list. Thomas rode straight to Pete's claim and found him limbing a ponderosa that had just come down. Got something to ask you, Thomas said. Pete set down his axe. Yeah. Need a foreman. $60 monthly. You want the job? Pete stared at him. Didn't speak for a long moment. You're having me on. Mrs. Whitmore hired me forest manager. I'm hiring you. $60. Pete said it slow, testing if the words would break apart. That's more than I make in 3 months of cutting. You got 3 kids at home, kids, a wife. You need it more than most. Thomas pulled out the list. I got 8 positions to fill. Yours is first, if you want it. Pete wiped his hands on his trousers, looked at Thomas, looked at the list. When do I start? 2 weeks. They shook on it. Thomas spent the next 5 days writing to the other names on Mrs. Whitmore's list. 2 were immigrants, 1 German who barely spoke English. 1 Irish man named O'Brien who'd lost 3 fingers to a sawmill back east. 3 were younger sons without inheritance or prospects. 1 was a former slave who'd worked his way west after the war and knew timber better than any white man Thomas had met. All of them good cutters. All of them needing better than Henley's wages. By day 25, Thomas had his crew signed. He moved to the company cabin that same day. Pete helped him haul his few belongings on a borrowed wagon. 2 rooms, like Mrs. Whitmore had promised. Plank floor without gaps, cast iron stove, shelves built into the walls, a rope bed in the back room, table and 2 chairs in the front, a real window with glass. More than he'd ever had, more than he'd thought to have. He spent 3 days walking the property, learning the boundary lines, counting the timber stands, making notes in a ledger Mrs. Whitmore had given him. The land was bigger than he'd thought possible, 2,400 acres. Some of it had been cut hard in the past clear sections, where nothing but scrub brush grew now. Other parts still virgin forest. Sugar pine and ponderosa standing tall like they'd been there since God first made trees. On day 30, his crew reported to the cabin. 8 men standing in his front room. Thomas spread the maps on the table, showed them what Mrs. Whitmore wanted done. We'll be cutting selective, one tree here, another there. Never strip a section bare, and for every tree we take down, we plant 2 seedlings back in its place. Jacob, one of the younger men, raised his hand. Who says we plant 2? I do. And the college agronomists Mrs. Whitmore is bringing in to teach us the method. They know more about growing trees than any of us know about cutting them. The crew looked at each other. This wasn't how timber work went. You cut until a section was bare, moved to the next section, cut that bare, left nothing but stumps, nobody replanted. That was farmer thinking. But they'd signed on for the wages, so they listened. The agronomists came from Berkeley 3 days later. 2 young men with notebooks and surveying equipment and theories about soil. They walked the cut sections with Thomas and his crew, showed them where to plant based on sun exposure and drainage, how deep to dig the holes, how far apart, what species for what kind of ground. Thomas learned fast, asked questions that made the agronomists look at him different, like maybe a timberman could think about more than next week's wages. They started explaining their research in more detail: growth rates, soil composition, how roots held hillsides together when the rains came. By day 50, the crew was planting their first section, sugar pine seedlings mostly. Some ponderosa mixed in. They used dibble bars to punch holes in the soil, canvas water bags to keep the roots moist during planting. Each man planted 10 trees daily. The work was slower than cutting, more careful. By week's end, 250 seedlings stood in rows where bare ground had been. Thomas walked those rows every evening after the crew went home, checked each tree, made sure the soil was packed right, made sure they had enough water. The work felt different from cutting timber, slower, like you had to think 20 years ahead instead of 20 feet. The months turned. Fall came, winter, spring, day 110. Late April, by Thomas's count. The crew had planted 1,500 seedlings across 4 sections. The earlier plantings from day 50 were taking hold now. Green shoots pushing up through soil, some already 6 inches tall. Thomas walked among them in the early morning, checking for disease or die-off. Found mostly health. Pete came up beside him. They stood there looking at rows of young trees. "Never thought I'd be a farmer," Pete said. "You're not. You're a forester." "What's the difference? Farmer harvests every year. We harvest every 20. Thomas knelt by a sugar pine seedling, touched the needles gentle. "These'll be standing long after we're both dead." Pete looked around at the rows. "My kids'll see how these tall." "That's the idea." They walked back toward the cabin where the rest of the crew was gathering. Smoke rose from the stove where Jacob was making coffee. The morning ritual before work started. Thomas had learned to value these quiet times, men drinking coffee, talking low. The day still cool before the sun climbed high and made you sweat. A carriage appeared on the north road, black paint, matched horses. Thomas knew it before it got close enough to see clear. "Company coming," Pete said. The carriage pulled up near the cabin. Ashford climbed down first, handed out Mrs. Whitmore. She wore traveling clothes, dark wool dress, practical boots. Behind them came 2 other men in suits, One carried a leather folder under his arm. "Mr. Brennan." Mrs. Whitmore approached with Ashford's hand on her elbow. "I've brought some people who want to see your operation." Thomas wiped his hands on his trousers. "Yes, ma'am." The two men introduced themselves. One was from the State Forestry Commission. The other represented timber interests in 3 counties. They wanted to see the planting work. Thomas showed them, walked them through the sections where seedlings stood in rows, explained the method, selective cutting, soil preparation, spacing requirements, watering schedules, showed them the 6-inch pines from day 50, answered questions about costs and labor requirements and timber yield projections 20 years out. The forestry man took notes in a small book, asked if Thomas would present his methods at a conference in Sacramento come fall. "I'm no speaker," Thomas said. "You don't need to be eloquent. You need to show what works." The man closed his notebook. "We've got timber operations, stripping land bare from here to Oregon. If your method proves out, we could mandate it statewide, make it law." They left an hour later. The investors climbed back in the carriage with Ashford. Mrs. Whitmore stayed behind, told Ashford to take them back to town. She'd find her own way. She walked with Thomas through the seedling rows, stopped by a young ponderosa, put her hand on it like she was testing if it was real. "You've done well here," she said. "Crew does the work. You lead them. That's harder." She turned to face him. "I'm expanding operations. 2 more parcels in Tehama County. Need managers there, too. Pete could do it. I was thinking you'd oversee both operations. Regional supervisor. $80 monthly. You'd split time between here and Tehama. Train new managers. Make sure the methods hold across different ground." Thomas looked at her. "I'm not qualified for that kind of work. You weren't qualified for this either. But you learned." She touched the ponderosa needles again like he'd done earlier. "I don't need qualified, Mr. Brennan. I need honest. I need someone who sees 20 years ahead instead of $20 ahead. I'll need to think on it. Good. Let me know by month's end." She started back toward the cabin. "I'll be in San Francisco if you need to reach me. Address is with Ashford." He watched her go. Small woman, old, moving slower now than she had at the courthouse. She climbed into the waiting carriage without help. Didn't look back. The horses pulled away. Dust rose and settled, and she was gone. Thomas stood there among the seedlings. The crew had gone back to work in the north section. He could hear axes in the distance. Selective cutting. 1 tree, maybe 2 today, enough to meet contracts without stripping the land bare. He walked to his original timber claim, 3 miles south. The walk took an hour. The cabin stood empty now. Door hanging open on leather hinges. Nobody had moved in. His sugar pine sections had been hauled off. Someone got the timber eventually. Just the slash piles left. He climbed to where his best stand had been. The trees he'd known by heart were stumps now, but between the stumps seedlings, 50 of them. He'd planted them himself before moving to the new cabin. Sugar pine, 2 months old now, 4 inches tall, growing. His old canteen hung from a low branch at the clearing's edge. He'd left it there the day he moved, a marker of something finished. The canvas cover had faded to gray. The cork stopper was cracked from sun exposure. It turned slowly in the wind. Thomas walked to it, reached up. His fingers touched the warm canvas. He could take it down, bring it with him, but he left it hanging there. It had carried him through 3 years of timber cutting, through the day that changed everything, through the walk home that nearly killed him. Now it just hung there, retired, a reminder. He turned and walked back through the seedlings toward his work. Behind him, The canteen turned in the wind, catching light, throwing shadow, a small thing that had once carried everything. Day 110, late April. Thomas knelt in fresh-turned earth, with a sugar pine seedling cupped in his scarred hands. The root ball felt delicate between his palms. He lowered it into the hole Pete had dug with the dibble bar, packed soil around it gentle with his fingertips, stood up and moved to the next hole. Behind him, 50 seedlings stood in rows, green shoots against brown earth. Beyond that, the mature forest reached up toward sky, sugar pine and ponderosa 100 feet tall. His crew worked the section in steady rhythm, 8 men planting with the patience he'd taught them. Pete called out spacing measurements. The others moved like they'd been doing this their whole lives, instead of 3 months. The work had changed them, changed Thomas too. His hands that knew axes and saws now knew seedlings, knew how to hold something fragile without crushing it, how to plant for 20 years ahead instead of next week's wages. He walked the rows, checking each tree, touched the needles, made sure the soil was packed right around the stems. The morning sun came through gaps in the canopy overhead, cut the air in shafts of light that moved when wind stirred the branches. Dust motes drifted in the beams. Somewhere, a jay called harsh and bright. This was his 5th section planted. 1,500 seedlings total across Mrs. Whitmore's Shasta County holdings. The early plantings from day 50 were 6 inches tall now, taking hold, green pushing up through soil that had been nothing but stumps and slash half a year ago. He'd signed the papers for regional supervisor 2 weeks back, $80 monthly, authority over 3 operations once the Tehama parcels were ready. Pete would run Tehama when the time came. $60 of his own. His wife had cried when Pete told her. Not sad crying, the other kind. Thomas walked to where Pete stood, marking the next row. They looked at the work done so far, the pattern of seedlings spreading across the hillside in lines that followed the contour of the land. Still feels strange, Pete said. Planting instead of cutting. You'll get used to it. Will I? Pete pulled off his hat, wiped his forehead with his sleeve. My whole life I've been taking trees down. Now I'm putting them back up. Not up, in. Thomas knelt by the nearest seedling. These grow themselves. We just give them a start. Pete was quiet a moment. My youngest asked me last night what I do for work now. I told him I plant trees. He said, that's not work. Papa, that's just putting things in the ground. I tried to explain, but I don't think he understood. He will when he's older, when these are tall and he can walk here with his own kids. If they're still standing, they will be, long after you and me are both dust. Thomas stood up, touched the seedling's needles gentle. That's the point of it. They walked back to where the crew was taking a water break. Jacob had brewed coffee in a tin pot over a small fire. They passed the pot around. Each man drank and handed it on. The coffee was bitter and strong and good. Tasted like work and morning and something being built slow. The afternoon wore on. They planted another 20 trees. When the sun started to drop, Thomas called it done. The crew gathered their tools, headed toward their cabins scattered across the property. Thomas and Pete stayed behind. You ready for Tehama? Thomas asked. No, but I'll do it anyway. That's all anyone can do. Pete gripped Thomas's shoulder once. Then he headed home too. Thomas stood alone among the seedlings. The evening light came in low and gold through the trees, made everything soft. He walked to his original claim, 3 miles south. Took him an hour. The walk was familiar now. He came here once a week to check on the seedlings he'd planted. The old cabin stood empty, door hanging crooked, window dark. Nobody had claimed it. Mrs. Whitmore's land, but she'd left the cabin standing. He climbed to where his best timber stand had been. The trees he'd known by heart were all stumps now. But between them, life. 50 seedlings he'd planted before moving north. 4 months' growth, 8 inches tall now, healthy. The needles were the right color green, no disease, no die-off. His canteen hung from a low branch at the clearing's edge where he'd left it. The canvas cover had faded almost white. The cork stopper was cracked. Rust showed at the metal seams where the tin was exposed. It turned slow in the evening wind. Thomas walked to it, reached up. His fingers touched the warm canvas. He could take it down, but he left it hanging. It marked something. Not just the end of one thing, but the start of another. He knelt by the nearest sugar pine, 4 months old. His scarred hands touched the thin trunk gentle. The bark was still smooth. Would be rough in another year. In 20 years, this would be thick as his leg. In 50 years, a man could hide behind it. In 100 years, someone who didn't know his name would look up at it and not think about the person who planted it. That was all right. The tree didn't need his name to grow. The sun dropped toward the western hills. Light came through the mature forest in long shafts that turned everything gold. The air smelled like pine and fresh earth. Somewhere close, a creek ran over stones. Wind moved through the canopy, making that sound Thomas had learned to love, needles touching each other soft like breathing. He stood, looked around at the clearing. Stumps and seedlings together. What was taken and what was given back. The balance Mrs. Whitmore had talked about. The long view past next month or next year, into a time he wouldn't see. Behind him, the canteen turned in wind. In front of him, the seedlings stood in their rows, green against earth. Alive, growing, reaching up toward light. Thomas picked up his tools from where he'd set them, shouldered them, started the walk back to his cabin. The 3 miles felt shorter now. He knew every turn in the path, every landmark. Tomorrow he'd ride to Tehama with Pete, look at the parcels Mrs. Whitmore had bought, start planning where to plant, how many men they'd need, what species would take best in that soil. The work spreading out like the seedlings, small now, but growing into something that would outlast them both. But tonight he just walked. Boots on soft earth packed down by his own feet, walking this path over and over. Light fading, shadows long, the smell of pine all around, thick and good. His hands had carried more than timber this year. His back had borne weight that wasn't measured in pounds. His throat had known thirst that taught him what water was really worth. The canteen had held everything that mattered, and he'd poured it out for a stranger dying in the road. That stranger had given him this. Thomas reached his cabin as dark came full, stars appearing one by one overhead, bright and cold. He went inside, lit the lamp. The flame caught and steadied. Yellow light filled the room and pushed the dark back into corners. The regional supervisor contract sat on his table. He'd read it so many times he had it memorized. Authority over 3 operations, partnership with the state college. Voice in how timber was managed across the whole county, maybe the whole state if the Sacramento Conference went well. He'd come west at 19 with nothing. Worked 3 years for a timber claim that nearly got stolen. Now he sat here with more responsibility than he had ever imagined. Not because he was smart or educated, or knew the right people, because he'd stopped on a road, because he'd poured out water, because he'd done one thing right when it would have been easier to do wrong. Thomas blew out the lamp. The cabin went dark except for starlight through the window. He lay down on his rope bed, The corn husk tick crackled under his weight. He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. His trees now in a way that had nothing to do with owning them. The seedlings he'd planted, the forest he was helping heal, the work that would go on long after his name was forgotten. Sleep came easy, the kind that comes from good work done and more work waiting. His hands rested on his chest, scarred and calloused from years of swinging axes, gentle now from months of planting seedlings, hands that had learned to give, to plant, to see beyond today into a future he'd never walk in but could help build anyway. Morning would come with new sections to plant, new crews to train, new ground to walk and assess and plan, the work spreading like roots underground, invisible but essential, holding things together, making growth possible. But tonight there was just the dark and the stars through the window and the sound of wind in the pines and Thomas Brennan's sleeping sound in a cabin that was his because he'd earned it by being kind. When kindness cost him everything and gave him more than he knew how to measure. There's something quiet that sits in the chest after a story like this. Not the clean feeling of a problem solved, but something heavier. The kind of weight that comes from recognizing how easily everything could have gone the other way. How close Thomas came to losing what little he had. How many times we've all stood at that same crossroads, holding something we need, faced with someone who needs it more. Many of us have carried that canteen, not the tin and canvas kind, but the invisible one, the last bit of strength, the final reserve we're rationing just to make it through. And we've passed people on our own roads who were collapsing in ways we couldn't always see. Some we stopped for, some we didn't. Both are true. Both are part of being human. This story doesn't erase the times we kept walking, doesn't solve the ache of wondering if we've done enough, given enough, been enough. Mrs. Whitmore arrived in that courtroom, but many of us have stood alone with no one coming. Thomas planted trees that would outlive him, but some of our best work stays buried, unseen, uncredited. It's all right that the wondering doesn't end here. Some things are meant to stay unresolved. Some weight we carry forward, because that's what it means to care. Thank you for staying with this, for listening all the way through to where the story settles but doesn't quite finish.